In Gilded Age New York, you could steal from your wife's trust fund. You could force your daughter to marry a man she despised. You could conduct an affair with your parishioner's wife while preaching morality to thousands. None of it would cost you a thing, so long as you never ever spoke about it publicly. Silence was the price of belonging, and belonging was worth more than truth. But between 1870 and 1952, 4 women broke that agreement. One used a novel, one used a newspaper, one used a blackmailer's ledger, one used a memoir she waited 60 years to write. Society never forgave a single one of them. Yesadert, Act 1. The World That Silence Built. Bestselling, Chapter 1. The Unwritten Law That Ruled America's Richest. There was no document, no statute, no proclamation, but every family on Fifth Avenue knew the rule, and every one of them obeyed it. It operated like gravity. You could not see it, could not touch it, but step wrong, and you fell. The rule was simple. Whatever happened inside the houses of the rich stayed inside those houses. Adultery, theft, cruelty, madness, addiction, all of it could be absorbed, all of it could be managed, all of it could be forgiven. The only thing that could not be forgiven was making it public. This was not a gentleman's agreement. It was the foundation of an empire. To understand why, you have to understand what was being protected. Between 1870 and 1900, a small group of families in New York City accumulated more wealth than any private citizens in the history of the world. The Vanderbilt fortune, built from railroads, peaked at roughly $200 million, the equivalent of more than $2 billion today. The Astors controlled swaths of Manhattan real estate, worth numbers that defied comprehension. The Belmonts, the Goulds, the Whitneys, the Havemeyers. Each name represented not just money, but a fiefdom. And the collective power of these fiefdoms created something that looked, from the outside, like an aristocracy. Because that is exactly what it was. The architecture of this aristocracy was meticulous. It had its own parliament, Mrs. William Backhouse Astor's famous 400, the precise number of guests who could fit in her ballroom, and the exact list of names who constituted acceptable society. It had its own census, the Social Register, first published in 1887, a slim volume that functioned as a catalog of the worthy. It had its own calendar, the Newport season in summer, the opera season in winter, the calling hours every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. And it had its own language, not English, cards, small rectangles of cream-colored paper, engraved, left on silver trays and marble foyers. A folded corner meant one thing, an unfolded corner meant another. 2 cards left together meant a married couple was acknowledging your existence. No card at all meant you did not exist. This system generated staggering sums just to sustain itself. Alva Vanderbilt's famous 1883 costume ball, designed to force Mrs. Astor to acknowledge the Vanderbilt family's social standing, cost approximately $60,000 at the time. In today's money, that is roughly $3 million for a single evening. Marble House, the Newport cottage Alva built as a summer retreat, cost $11 million in 1892. Adjusted for today, that figure exceeds $350 million. The Jones family, old New York money, and the inspiration for the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, maintained a household income equivalent to roughly $600,000 a year in today's money, and they were considered modest. This was the scale of the world that silence protected, and silence did protect it, because behind the marble facades and the calling cards and the opera boxes, these families were engaged in behavior that, if spoken aloud, would have destroyed them. Husbands kept mistresses on side streets. Wives were abandoned for years at a time. Sons drank themselves to death. Daughters were sold into marriages that functioned as business mergers. Trust funds were raided. Children were disinherited for loving the wrong person. None of it mattered, so long as the surface remained smooth. The surface was everything. The surface was the entire point. The code of silence was not about morality. It was about property. Reputation was the most valuable asset these families owned, more valuable than the railroads or the real estate or the art collections, because reputation determined access, and access determined everything else. Lose your reputation and you lost your seat at the table. Lose your seat and you lost your deals. Lose your deals and you lost your fortune. The code existed to prevent that chain reaction. It was a financial instrument disguised as manners. And for decades, it worked perfectly. The men profited, the women obeyed, the servants stayed silent, the newspapers stayed polite. The system hummed along, elegant and airtight, until 4 women decided, one by one, that the truth was worth more than the silence. What happened next would unfold across 6 decades and 3 continents. And it would prove that the code was right about one thing. The cost of honesty was real, it was devastating, and the system made sure every woman who paid it paid in full. Chapter 2. 4 women who knew too much. Each of them occupied a different rung of the same ladder, and each of them looked down and saw the same rot underneath. Edith Newbold Jones was born in 1862 into the innermost circle of old New York. Her family had been wealthy for generations. They were not Vanderbilt wealthy, not railroad wealthy, but they were something the Vanderbilts could never buy: established. The Joneses belonged. Edith grew up in brownstones on 23rd Street, spent summers in Newport, traveled through Europe as a child, and absorbed the rituals of her class the way other children absorb nursery rhymes. She knew when to call and when not to. She knew which families mattered and which were pretending. She knew the silence, and she kept it. For decades, she kept it. She would become Edith Wharton, and she would eventually take everything she knew and write it down in novels that her former friends could not stop reading and could not forgive. Victoria Claflin was born in 1838 in Homer, Ohio, into a family that was, by any measure, the opposite of the Joneses. Her father, Reuben Claflin, was a con man. Her mother was illiterate. The family traveled from town to town, running what amounted to a medicine show, selling patent cures and spiritual readings. Victoria had almost no formal education. She married at 15 to a man named Canning Woodhull, a doctor who turned out to be an alcoholic. By the time she was 20, she had a child, a failing marriage, and no money. She had absolutely nothing that should have allowed her anywhere near Fifth Avenue. But Victoria Woodhull had something the women of Fifth Avenue did not. She had nothing to lose, and that made her the most dangerous woman in New York. The third group of women in this story has no names. They never gave interviews. They never wrote memoirs. They are ghosts in the historical record, visible only through the effects they created. These were the society wives, the women embedded inside the code of silence, who fed secrets to a man named Colonel William Dalton Mann. Mann ran a gossip sheet called Town Topics, and he used the information these women provided to extort their husbands, their friends, and their rivals. The women who filled Mann's ledger betrayed the code from within, using a man as their weapon, and they did it for reasons that range from petty jealousy to calculated revenge. They are the most invisible figures in this story. They may also be the most subversive. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 years old in 1895. She was the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt, which meant she was the granddaughter of the railroad king and the daughter of the most ruthlessly ambitious woman in New York society. Consuelo did not choose to break the code. The code was broken over her body. Her mother forced her into a marriage with the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a man she did not love and barely knew, in exchange for a dowry that would restore a crumbling English palace. Consuelo was not a rebel. She was currency. She was spent. And 57 years later, when she was 75 years old and most of the people who had hurt her were dead, she wrote it all down. 4 women, 4 different positions on the same ladder. One understood the code from the inside, one attacked it from the outside, some betrayed it in secret, and one was crushed by it in public. Each of them would choose a different weapon, and each of them would learn the same lesson. The code did not care whether you were born to it, or married into it, or fought your way in from nothing. The code only cared about one thing. Had you spoken? Had you told the truth? Had you broken the agreement? Because if you had, the punishment was always the same. You were removed. The only question was how long it would take. Chapter 3. The marriage market where daughters were currency. Between 1870 and 1914, roughly 500 American women were married to European aristocrats, and their families transferred an estimated $6.5 billion in today's money across the Atlantic. The numbers are staggering, but they do not capture the reality. What those numbers represent is a market. a literal, functioning market in which American daughters were the commodity and European titles were the product. The families paid, the daughters complied, the aristocrats received, and the code of silence ensured that everyone pretended it was romance. Nobody pretended harder than Alva Vanderbilt. Alva was not born wealthy. She came from a Southern family that lost most of its money after the Civil War, and she married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875 with the clear intention of climbing as high as money could take her. She was brilliant at it. The 1883 ball that forced Mrs. Astor's hand was her masterpiece, a social coup planned with military precision. By the early 1890s, Alva was one of the most powerful women in New York, and she had a daughter. Consuelo was tall, beautiful, and miserable. She had fallen in love with a man named Winthrop Rutherford, a perfectly respectable New Yorker from an old family. Alva did not care. Rutherford was not a duke. Alva wanted a duke. Specifically, she wanted Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, whose family seat, Blenheim Palace, was falling apart and whose finances were in ruin. The Duke needed money. Alva had money. Consuelo was the mechanism by which money would become a title. What Alva did to her daughter to make this happen was, even by the standards of the Gilded Age, extreme. She forced Consuelo to wear a steel back brace, ostensibly to improve her posture. The brace kept the girl rigid, upright, unable to slouch or relax. It was a physical instrument of control strapped to the body of a teenager, and it functioned as a metaphor for everything the code demanded. Sit straight, look right, do not bend, do not speak. When Consuelo resisted the marriage, Alva locked her in her bedroom. When Consuelo begged to see Rutherford, Alva told her, according to Consuelo's own account, that she would murder the man before she allowed her daughter to marry him. On the morning of the wedding, a friend found Consuelo weeping in her room. The ceremony went ahead anyway. The wedding took place at St. Thomas Church on 5th Avenue on November 6, 1895. The New York Times devoted pages to it. The flowers, the guests, the dress, the procession. What the newspapers did not report was that the Duke had skipped the rehearsal. He had, however, attended the meeting where the financial settlement was negotiated. The dowry was $2.5 million in Beech Creek Railroad stock, generating roughly $100,000 a year in guaranteed income. In today's dollars, that dowry was worth somewhere between $75 million and $125 million. The Duke's family would use it to restore Blenheim Palace. Consuelo walked down the aisle with tears streaming behind her veil. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of old New York, another woman was living a different version of the same trap. Edith Jones had married Edward Teddy Wharton in 1885 at the age of 23. The match was considered appropriate. Teddy came from a good family. He was handsome, social, and utterly without intellectual ambition. Edith, who had been writing since childhood and whose mind was among the sharpest of her generation, found herself married to a man who could not understand a single thing she cared about. When young Edith had asked her mother, Lucretia, what to expect on her wedding night, Lucretia's response was a masterpiece of the code. She told her daughter that it would be unpleasant and that she should never speak of it again. Edith entered her marriage with no knowledge of physical intimacy and spent years in what she would later describe as a kind of bewildered suffering. The Wharton marriage was a slow drowning. Teddy was kind enough at first, then unstable, then genuinely ill. Edith poured her energy into writing, into the Mount, the estate she designed in Lenox, Massachusetts, into her growing circle of literary friendships. But the marriage was an empty room she could not leave, because leaving would mean speaking, and speaking would mean breaking the code. These two women, Consuelo at the altar and Edith in her library, occupied opposite ends of the same prison. One was forced in violently. The other walked in willingly and found the door locked from outside. Both were trapped by the same principle. The code did not require happiness. It did not require love. It required only that the surface remain unbroken. In 1895, standing in St. Thomas Church, watching her daughter cry in silence while a cathedral full of the richest people in America pretended not to notice, the dream of Gilded Age society was at its glittering, fraudulent peak. The code was holding, the surface was smooth, the silence was absolute. But not for long, because 300 miles to the south and 23 years earlier, A woman from Ohio with no money, no education, and no connections had already declared war on the entire system. And she had done the one thing no one in that church would have dared. She had told the truth out loud. Aced 2. The Weapons They Chose. Chapter 4. The Outsider Who Stormed Wall Street. She had no education, no money, no social credentials, and within 2 years she had charmed the richest man in America out of his stock tips and opened a brokerage on Broad Street. Victoria Woodhull's arrival in New York City in 1868 should have been unremarkable. She was 30 years old. She had a young son with cerebral palsy, a sister named Tennessee Claflin who shared her talents for persuasion, and a past that included traveling medicine shows, spiritual readings, and a failed marriage to an alcoholic. She had precisely nothing that mattered in Gilded Age New York. No name, no family, no fortune, no invitation to anything. What she had was nerve and a plan. The plan started with Cornelius Vanderbilt. The Commodore was 74 years old, the richest man in America, and a devoted believer in spiritualism. He had recently lost his wife and was in the habit of consulting mediums and clairvoyants. Victoria and Tennessee arranged to meet him. The specifics of how they gained access are disputed. What is not disputed is what happened next. Vanderbilt was charmed, more than charmed. He began sharing stock tips with Victoria. Some historians have suggested the relationship with Tennessee was more intimate than advisory. What is certain is that Vanderbilt's information was extraordinarily good. The scale of what followed is difficult to overstate. Cornelius Vanderbilt's personal fortune at the time was roughly $100 million. In today's money, that exceeds $2.3 billion. The tips he shared with Woodhull, combined with her own intelligence and her sister's fearlessness, generated estimated trading profits of around $700,000, the equivalent of roughly $15 million today. In 1870, Victoria and Tennessee did something no woman in America had ever done. They opened their own brokerage firm. Woodhull, Claflin and Company, located at 44 Broad Street, just off Wall Street, became the first female-owned brokerage in American history. The newspapers called them the Queens of Finance. The Wall Street establishment was appalled. Men who transacted millions in railroad stocks could not stomach the sight of two women doing the same. Reporters crowded the sidewalk outside 44 Broad Street. Curiosity seekers pressed against the windows. Victoria and Tennessee dressed well, spoke confidently, and refused to apologize for their presence. The brokerage was profitable. It was also a provocation. Every trade they executed was an argument that the walls separating men's work from women's work were artificial. Every profit they recorded was evidence that the code governing who could participate in the economy was a lie. But Victoria had no interest in being merely rich. She wanted power, and she understood, with a clarity that few of her contemporaries matched, that the code of silence was the lock on the door of American public life. If you could not speak the truth about how the powerful actually lived, you could never challenge their authority. So, she decided to speak. In 1870, she founded a newspaper. Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly was unlike anything in American journalism. It published articles on women's suffrage, free love, labor reform, and the private behavior of public men. Its circulation grew rapidly. Victoria used it as a platform for something even more audacious. On January 11, 1871, she became the first woman in American history to address a committee of the United States Congress, delivering a memorial arguing that the 14th and 15th Amendments already guaranteed women the right to vote. The performance was electric. Susan B. Anthony, the most prominent suffragist in the country, embraced her publicly. Elizabeth Cady Stanton praised her courage. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull did the unthinkable. She declared her candidacy for President of the United States. The Equal Rights Party nominated her at its convention in New York, with Frederick Douglass named as her running mate, though Douglass never acknowledged the nomination. She was 34 years old, a former medicine show performer, a woman who could not legally vote for herself, running for the highest office in the nation. The establishment was not amused, but the establishment had not yet been truly threatened. That would come later. That would come when Victoria aimed her newspaper at the single most powerful clergyman in America and pulled the trigger. Henry Ward Beecher was the pastor of Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. He was the most famous preacher in the country, drawing thousands to his sermons every week. He was a moral authority, a public philosopher, a man whose words shaped how Americans understood virtue and sin. He was also, as many people in his social circle knew, conducting an affair with Elizabeth Tilton, the wife of Theodore Tilton, one of his parishioners. The affair was an open secret. Everyone in Beecher's world knew about it. Nobody spoke about it. The code was operating exactly as designed. Victoria Woodhull knew about the affair. She had heard it from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among others. And what enraged her was not the affair itself. Victoria was an advocate of free love. She believed that men and women should be free to love whom they chose. What enraged her was the hypocrisy. Beecher preached morality from the pulpit while breaking his own rules in private, and the code of silence, the same code that governed Fifth Avenue, protected him absolutely. His congregation knew, his family knew, his peers knew, and nobody said a word. Victoria said a word. On November 2nd, 1872, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly published a detailed account of the Beecher affair. The article named names. It provided specifics. It broke the code as thoroughly and publicly as it had ever been broken. The reaction was immediate, and it had nothing to do with whether the story was true. Within days, Victoria was arrested. The charge was not libel because the story could not be proven false. The charge was obscenity. Anthony Comstock, the self-appointed guardian of American morality, had her taken into custody under a federal law that prohibited sending obscene material through the mail. Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president, spent election night in a cell at the Ludlow Street Jail. She had broken the code. The code would now break her. But that punishment was still ahead. In this moment, in the autumn of 1872, Victoria Woodhull stood at the summit of a career that should have been impossible. A woman with nothing had built a brokerage, a newspaper, a political movement, and a presidential campaign. She had done it with intelligence, audacity, and a willingness to say out loud what everyone else whispered. The question was not whether the system would respond. The question was how completely it would destroy her. Chapter 5. The novelist who turned dinner parties into evidence. Every character was fictional, every address was invented, and every person who read The House of Mirth in 1905 recognized the people sitting next to them at dinner. Edith Wharton did not storm the gates. She opened them from inside, wearing gloves, smiling politely, and holding a manuscript that would set fire to everything she had been raised to protect. The House of Mirth was published in October of 1905 by Charles Scribner's Sons. It told the story of Lily Bart, a beautiful, intelligent, unmarried woman navigating the treacherous social world of Gilded Age New York. Lily is not wealthy enough to be independent. She is too proud to sell herself in marriage for money, and she discovers, chapter by chapter, that the system has no room for a woman who refuses to play by its rules. By the end of the novel, Lily is dead, alone, forgotten, destroyed not by any single villain, but by the accumulated weight of a world that treats women as ornaments and punishes them for being anything else. The novel sold 140,000 copies in its first year. In publishing terms, this was an earthquake. Serialized first in Scribner's magazine, where it drew readers month after month with the slow agony of Lily's descent, the book became a cultural event before it even reached bookstores. Wharton earned approximately $60,000 in royalties from the House of Mirth, equivalent to roughly $2 million today. Strangers wrote to her. Critics praised her. The literary world recognized that something significant had happened, but the money was not the point. The point was what the book said and who recognized themselves in it. Lily Bart was a composite. Wharton drew her from the real women she had watched be destroyed by the very world she described. The dinner parties were real dinner parties. The drawing rooms were real drawing rooms. The cruelties were cruelties Wharton had witnessed firsthand. The tableau vivant scene in which Lily poses as a figure from a painting, offering her beauty as spectacle while the audience consumes her, was drawn from actual society performances Wharton had attended. Wharton understood the code because she had lived inside it her entire life. She knew the precise weight of a calling card. She knew the exact meaning of a chair placed 6 inches too far from the fire. She knew the difference between being snubbed and being erased. and she put all of it on the page with the precision of a surgeon and the anger of a woman who had spent 40 years pretending not to see what was in front of her. While the House of Mirth was making Edith Wharton famous, her private life was collapsing in ways that mirrored her fiction with almost unbearable irony. Her marriage to Teddy had become a catastrophe. Teddy's mental health was deteriorating. He was volatile, depressed, and increasingly unreliable. But the true blow came when Edith discovered that Teddy had been embezzling from her trust fund. He had taken approximately $50,000, the equivalent of about $1.6 million today, and used it to set up a mistress in a Boston apartment. He had bought the apartment with Edith's money. He had furnished it with Edith's money. He had maintained the woman in it with Edith's money. And he had done all of this while Edith was the primary earner in the family, the woman whose novels were generating the income he was stealing. The code of silence told Edith Wharton to absorb this. The code told her to manage it quietly, to move the money, to dismiss the servants who knew, to carry on. And for a while, she did. But something else was happening. In 1907, Wharton began an affair with Morton Fullerton, an American journalist living in Paris. Fullerton was charming, cultured, and sexually experienced in ways that Teddy had never been. For Edith, who had entered her marriage knowing virtually nothing about physical intimacy, and had spent decades in what she described as a kind of frozen bewilderment, the affair was a revelation. She was 45 years old. She was, for the first time in her life, experiencing genuine physical and emotional passion. She wrote about it, not in her novels, in private documents, love letters to Fullerton that were sealed after her death, and a fragment of erotic fiction called Beatrice Palmato that would not be discovered until decades later. These were the private records of a woman who had spent her entire life inside the code and was finally secretly breaking it. The affair did not last. Fullerton was unreliable, entangled with other women, possibly being blackmailed himself, but it changed Wharton permanently. She had seen, from the inside, what the code cost women in their most private and fundamental lives. She had felt the cost in her own body, and she would spend the rest of her career writing about it. After the House of Mirth came the Custom of the Country in 1913, a savage portrait of American social climbing, and then, in 1920, The Age of Innocence. This novel, set in the 1870s New York of Wharton's childhood, told the story of a man who falls in love with a woman his society will not accept and chooses, in the end, to submit, to stay, to be silent. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1921, making Wharton the first woman to receive the honor. Every character in The Age of Innocence was fictional. Every reader in Old New York knew exactly who they were, and every one of them understood what Wharton had done. She had taken the private architecture of their world, the rules they never spoke aloud, the cruelties they never acknowledged, the bargains they never admitted to making, and she had published it, beautifully, precisely, unforgivably. The cost of seeing clearly was something Edith Wharton had been calculating her entire life. She had watched Lily Bart pay it in fiction. She had watched the real women behind Lily pay it in life. Now she would pay it herself. But before we reach her punishment, there is another weapon to examine, one that operated not in bookstores but in back rooms, not through fiction but through fact, and not through a single brilliant woman but through a network of nameless ones. Chapter 6. The Blackmailer's Ledger and the Women Who Filled It. Colonel Mann did not need to spy on high society because high society's own wives were feeding him every secret he published. Colonel William D. Alton Mann was not, strictly speaking, a colonel. He had served in the Civil War and done reasonably well, but his title was more self-promotion than military record. By the 1890s, he was a stout, white-bearded figure who looked like a gentlemanly Santa Claus and operated like a gangster. His weapon was a weekly society journal called Town Topics, and his business model was simple. He collected scandalous information about the richest people in New York. Then he offered them a choice: pay him, and the information stayed out of print. Refuse, and it appeared in the next edition. The operation was remarkably efficient. Mann charged a minimum of $1,500 per suppressed item, the equivalent of roughly $50,000 today. William K. Vanderbilt, Consuelo's father, reportedly paid $25,000 to keep certain stories out of town topics. That figure, adjusted, exceeds $800,000 in today's money. The Belmonts paid. The Goulds paid. Names that commanded empires wrote checks to a man with a gossip column because the alternative was worse. Mann also published a companion volume called Fads and Fancies of Representative Americans, a handsome, leather-bound book that was essentially a printed receipt for extortion. If your flattering biography appeared in the book, it meant you had paid. If it did not, it meant you had refused, and everyone who read Town Topics knew what was coming. But here is the part of the story that history has largely overlooked. Mann did not employ a network of investigators. He did not need to. He did not hire spies to peer through keyholes or bribe servants for information. The information came to him voluntarily, and it came from inside the houses. The women of Gilded Age New York, the wives and daughters and social rivals who were themselves prisoners of the Code of Silence, were Mann's primary sources. They came to him with stories about their friends, they came with stories about their enemies, they came with stories about the women their husbands were sleeping with, and the men their rivals were entertaining. Their motives were as varied as the scandals they provided: jealousy, revenge, boredom, the thrill of wielding power in a world that gave them almost none. These women are invisible in the historical record. Mann protected his sources with the same ruthlessness he used to exploit his targets. No names, no acknowledgments, no paper trail. They exist only as shadows inferred from the nature and specificity of the information Town Topics published. You could not know that Mrs. So-and-so had been seen entering a hotel on 23rd Street at 4 in the afternoon, unless someone inside Mrs. So-and-so's social circle had watched her do it. You could not know the precise amount of a private financial settlement unless someone with access to family papers had shared it. These unnamed women were, in a sense, the most radical figures in this story. Wharton used fiction. Woodhull used journalism. Consuelo would eventually use memoir. But the informants used the code against itself. They exploited the very access that the code gave them, the intimate knowledge of private lives that came from being inside the drawing room, and they weaponized it. They did not leave the system. They corrupted it from within, and the system, remarkably, could not stop them, because to stop them would have required acknowledging that the secrets existed, and the code forbade that acknowledgement. Mann's operation thrived through the 1890s and into the 1900s. Town Topics became required reading among the very people it terrorized. The rich subscribed to it, they read it at breakfast, they checked each edition the way a soldier checks for incoming fire, and they paid, quietly, consistently, because paying was cheaper than exposure, and exposure was the one thing the code could not survive. The unraveling began, as it so often does, because one person refused to pay. Emily Post was, in the early 1900s, a society wife. Her husband, Edwin Post, was a banker. Mann's associates approached Edwin with information about his personal life and suggested that a payment of $500 would make the information disappear. $500 in 1905 was approximately $17,000 today. Not a fortune, certainly within the means of a banker. Most men in Edwin's position paid without hesitation. Edwin hesitated. Emily told him not to pay. More than that, she told him to call the district attorney. This was an extraordinary decision, not because it was brave, though it was, but because it violated the code. The correct response, the response the code demanded, was to pay quietly and move on. To involve the law was to make the matter public. To make it public was to break the silence. Emily Post broke the silence. The district attorney's office investigated. In 1905, a public trial unfolded. Mann sued Collier's Weekly, which had published a lengthy expose of his extortion operation. The case put Mann's methods on public display. The jury acquitted Norman Hapgood, the Collier's editor, in minutes. Mann's empire began to collapse. But here is the irony that makes this chapter essential to the larger story. Emily Post, the woman whose single decisive act cracked the foundation of Mann's operation, would go on to become the most famous arbiter of manners in American history. Her book Etiquette, published in 1922, would sell millions of copies and establish her as the national authority on how to behave in polite society. Emily Post built a career on the wreckage of the code she helped break. She taught Americans the rules of a world she had personally helped destroy, and the women who had fed man his ammunition, they vanished. When the trial ended and the ledgers were examined and the dust settled, not a single one of the society wives who had served as man's informants was ever identified in public. They retreated into the silence that had created them. They disappeared behind the code. Their secrets died with them. Their impact did not. Act 3, The Punishment. Chapter 7, The Night She Spent the Election in a Jail Cell. On November 2, 1872, Victoria Woodhull became the first woman to run for President of the United States, and she marked the occasion from inside the Ludlow Street Jail. The arrest had come the day before. Federal marshals, acting on a complaint from Anthony Comstock, took Victoria and Tennessee Claflin into custody for sending obscene material through the mail. The material in question was the November 2nd edition of Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, the issue containing the detailed account of Henry Ward Beecher's affair with Elizabeth Tilton. The charge was not libel. It could not be. The story was true. Beecher was conducting the affair. Multiple people inside his circle knew it. Theodore Tilton, Elizabeth's husband, had confronted Beecher about it. The facts were not in dispute. What was in dispute, or rather what the prosecution pretended was in dispute, was whether describing an extramarital affair in a newspaper constituted obscenity. This was the genius of the code in action. The system did not need to prove Woodhull wrong. It only needed to punish her for speaking, and it had the perfect instrument. The Comstock Act of 1873, which would be passed in direct response to the Woodhull case, would formalize the principle. The law criminalized the distribution of obscene material through the United States mail. It was aimed at pornographers, but its language was broad enough to encompass virtually anything that discussed sexual behavior. It would remain on the books for decades, and its first major target was a woman who had done nothing more than tell the truth about a famous man. Victoria spent 6 weeks in jail. The cell at Ludlow Street was cold, filthy, and designed to humiliate. She was not permitted bail for days. When bail was finally arranged, the amount was staggering. Over the course of the legal battles that followed, Woodhull spent the equivalent of roughly $500,000 in today's money on bail, legal fees, and associated costs. For a woman who had built her fortune from nothing, the financial destruction was calculated and precise. Her presidential campaign evaporated. Her newspaper was seized. Her name, which had once appeared in headlines celebrating her audacity, now appeared only in connection with obscenity and scandal. The parallels to her earlier triumphs were cruel. The same newspapers that had called her the Queen of Finance now called her a disgrace. The same political circles that had invited her to speak before Congress now denied knowing her. The brokerage on Broad Street, the first female-owned brokerage in American history, closed its doors. The building that had symbolized everything she had achieved went dark. The trial that followed the Beecher exposé was not one trial, but a cascade. There were criminal proceedings against Woodhull. There were civil proceedings between Theodore Tilton and Beecher. There was an ecclesiastical investigation by Plymouth Church. The combined legal spectacle lasted 3 years and generated tens of thousands of pages of testimony. Witnesses were called, depositions were taken. The private lives of some of the most prominent people in America were examined in excruciating detail. And at the end of it all, Beecher was never convicted of anything. The civil jury deadlocked. The church investigation cleared him. The criminal charges against Woodhull were eventually dropped, but only after she had been arrested, jailed, tried, ruined, and publicly branded as a dangerous radical. The system did not need a conviction. It needed the process. The arrest was the punishment. The trial was the punishment. The cost, financial, social, personal, was the punishment. The suffrage movement, which had once embraced Woodhull, abandoned her with stunning speed. Susan B. Anthony, who had stood beside her at the congressional hearing, turned away. The movement could not afford to be associated with a woman charged with obscenity. It did not matter that the charge was fraudulent. It did not matter that the story was true. What mattered was that Woodhull had broken the code, and association with her was now contaminated. The women who had cheered her address to Congress in 1871 were the same women who crossed the street to avoid her by 1874. The solidarity of the movement, which Woodhull had believed in with genuine passion, evaporated the moment the cost of solidarity became real. The brokerage closed, the newspaper folded, the speaking engagements dried up, the political alliances dissolved. Victoria's health suffered, her finances collapsed. The woman who had earned the equivalent of $15 million in trading profits found herself counting pennies. By 1877, Victoria Woodhull was nearly destitute. The woman who had opened the first female brokerage on Wall Street, who had addressed Congress, who had run for president, who had taken on the most powerful clergyman in America with nothing but the truth, was financially ruined and socially dead in the country she had tried to change. She did not die in America. She could not afford to stay. What happened to Victoria Woodhull after the destruction of her American career would take her across an ocean and into a life so different from her first one that it seemed to belong to a different person entirely. But before we follow her into exile, we need to see how the same system, using different tools but the same logic, handled a woman it could not arrest. Chapter 8. The calling cards that stopped arriving. No one in old New York ever told Edith Wharton she was unwelcome. They simply stopped leaving their cards, and she understood the language perfectly. Wharton's punishment was not dramatic. There was no arrest, no trial, no newspaper headlines. There was only the slow, elegant surgical removal of a woman from the world she had been born into, and it was carried out with the very instruments she had described in her own novels. After The Age of Innocence won the Pulitzer Prize in 1921, Wharton should have been celebrated. She was, by any literary measure, a triumph. She was the first woman to win the prize. She had written a novel that was both a critical masterpiece and a commercial success. She was the most prominent American novelist of her generation. Her old world did not see it that way. What old New York saw was betrayal. Wharton had taken the private architecture of their lives and made it public. She had named the code, described its mechanisms, cataloged its cruelties. She had done it with fiction, which was worse than journalism in some ways, because fiction allowed her to say things no newspaper would print and no lawsuit could challenge. You could not sue a woman for writing a novel, but you could stop leaving your card. The cards stopped. The invitations thinned. The doors that had once opened automatically now required a knock, and the knock went unanswered. This was the code operating at its most refined. No confrontation, no accusation, no scene, just absence. Just the gradual, unmistakable withdrawal of the warmth that constituted belonging. Wharton had already begun to separate herself from New York before the full weight of the exile settled. She sold the Mount, the beloved Lenox estate, in 1911. The sale was a wound. Wharton had designed the Mount herself, working with the architect Ogden Codman. It was her first true home, a place where she could write and think and entertain the literary friends who understood her. The gardens were her creation. The library was her sanctuary. Giving it up meant giving up the physical space where she had first become the writer she was meant to be. But the marriage to Teddy was collapsing. The costs were unsustainable, and the estate that represented her independence became one more thing the code extracted as payment. The divorce from Teddy was finalized in 1913. It was handled quietly in Paris, away from the scrutiny of New York. Even in her rebellion, Wharton maintained a certain discretion. She did not give interviews. She did not make accusations. She simply ended the marriage and moved on. But the permanent move to France was not entirely voluntary. It was also a recognition that the world she came from had decided she no longer belonged to it. In France, Wharton found something New York had never given her, a culture that treated writers as intellectuals rather than entertainers. She became close friends with Henry James, who had made the same transatlantic migration years earlier. She entertained at her estates with a warmth and generosity that her New York circles would have recognized. But the guests were different now. They were writers, artists, diplomats, thinkers. They were not the people she had grown up with. They were the people she had chosen. The exile was real, but it was also, in its way, a liberation. The contrast between Woodhull's punishment and Wharton's is the point of this story. Woodhull was arrested, jailed, tried, bankrupted. The violence was public and crude. Wharton was simply erased. The violence was private and elegant. But the result was identical. Both women were removed from the community. Both women spent the rest of their lives in a country that was not the one they were born in. And both women were punished not for lying, but for telling the truth. While Wharton was adjusting to her quiet exile, The Town Topic saga was reaching its conclusion. The Collier's trial had exposed man's methods. The jury's rapid acquittal of Hapgood had signaled that the public's tolerance for man's particular brand of silence enforcement had limits. Man's operation did not collapse overnight, but it decayed. Town Topics continued to publish, but its power was broken. The threat of exposure no longer carried the same weight when the mechanism of suppression had been publicly displayed. And the women who had filled man's ledger? They disappeared completely. When the trial records were examined, when the investigators traced the origins of man's information, they found what amounted to a void. The society wives who had fed man the secrets of their world were protected by the same code they had betrayed. Nobody would name them. Nobody could prove their involvement. They existed in the space between the lines of testimony, visible only as the absence of an explanation. This is perhaps the most revealing detail in the entire story. The code of silence could absorb the exposure of the blackmailer. It could absorb the trial. It could absorb the public humiliation of the men who had paid hush money. What it could not absorb was the identification of the women who had broken it from inside, because identifying them would mean admitting that the code had been compromised at its core, that the women who were supposed to be its most loyal guardians had been its most effective saboteurs. The code protected its betrayers to protect itself, and the women vanished into history without a name. One more woman remained. One more breach of the code had yet to be committed, and it would take 60 years for the words to finally be spoken. Earth Chapter 9. 60 years of silence before she finally spoke. Consuelo Vanderbilt waited until she was 75 years old, until most of the people who had hurt her were dead. And then she told the world everything. The Glitter and the Gold was published in 1952. The title itself was a judgment, distinguishing the bright surface from the substance underneath. And what Consuelo put on its pages was a measured, devastating, and unforgettable account of what had been done to her. She described the locked bedroom. She described her mother's rage. She described the threat against Winthrop Rutherford. She described the morning of the wedding, alone in her room, weeping. She described the ceremony itself, the tears behind the veil, the cathedral full of people who saw and said nothing. She described the Duke's behavior on their honeymoon, his early declaration that he had married her to save Blenheim, and for no other reason. She described the loneliness of life in an English palace that was falling apart, surrounded by servants who pitied her and in-laws who resented her. The details of Blenheim were devastating in their specificity. The palace was enormous and freezing. The rooms were so vast that intimate conversation was nearly impossible. The Churchills treated her as an interloper, tolerated because of the money she brought, but never accepted as one of their own. Consuelo bore 2 sons, John and Ivor, fulfilling her biological obligation to the Marlborough line. She worked tirelessly to restore the palace, to manage its staff, to present the public face of a duchess. And she did all of it while knowing that her husband had never wanted her, only her dowry. The marriage was a business transaction in which she was simultaneously the product and the payment. The memoir was precise. Consuelo did not scream or rage. She stated facts, she named dates, she provided context, and she let the reader draw the inevitable conclusion that she had been sold, that her mother had sold her, that the code of silence had wrapped the transaction in flowers and music and newspaper coverage and called it a wedding. Perhaps the most devastating moment in the book came not from Consuelo herself, but from her mother. During the annulment proceedings that Consuelo pursued decades after the marriage, Alva Vanderbilt, now Alva Belmont after her second marriage, provided testimony that confirmed everything her daughter had claimed. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," Alva stated. "I have always had absolute power over my daughter." The words are remarkable not for their content, which everyone already knew, but for the fact that they were spoken at all. Alva broke the code herself, but only in service of her daughter's legal freedom. She admitted the truth because the truth was useful to her. The Glitter and the Gold coined a phrase that would outlive its author. Consuelo described the pressure to produce male children as the obligation to provide an heir and a spare. The phrase entered the English language. It would be used a century later by Prince Harry as the title of his own memoir, a book that was itself an act of code-breaking, a member of a royal family telling truths that the institution demanded remain unspoken. The memoir was a bestseller. Reviewers praised its elegance and restraint. The public was fascinated by this window into a world that had always hidden behind its own walls. And old society, what remained of it, responded exactly as it always had. The response was not anger. Anger would have been too public. The response was the familiar withdrawal, the turned shoulder, the empty chair, the invitation that did not arrive. Consuelo had waited 57 years. She had waited until her mother was dead, until the Duke was dead, until most of the guests at that 1895 wedding were dead. She had outlived her oppressors, and still the code reached across the decades to extract its price. By 1952, the world that had produced the code was largely gone. The great Fifth Avenue mansions had been torn down or converted. The 400 had dissolved into a broader, less rigidly defined upper class. The calling card ritual had faded. The social register still existed, but it no longer determined who mattered. The world had changed, but the principle had not. The code of silence had no statute of limitations. It did not matter that Consuelo was 75. It did not matter that she had waited until the principles were dead. It did not matter that what she described was common knowledge. What mattered was that she had spoken. What mattered was that she had written it down. What mattered was that she had broken the agreement. Act 3 ends here, at the point of convergence. 4 women, 4 weapons, a newspaper, a novel, a blackmailer's ledger, a memoir, 4 punishments, arrest and ruin, social exile, historical erasure, decades of silence followed by the same exile visited upon the others. And a single truth that connects all 4. The system did not punish them for what they said. Every fact Woodhull published about Beecher was true. Every scene Wharton wrote was drawn from life. Every secret man's informants provided was accurate. Every word of Consuelo's memoir was confirmed by her own mother. The system punished them for saying it, for breaking the silence, for making public what was meant to stay private. The code did not require that its members be good. It required only that they be quiet, and the women who refused to be quiet paid the same price, every one of them, across 6 decades. They were removed. War sta CT4, What Survived the Silence. Chapter 10, Exile as the Price of Honesty. Wharton died in France, Woodhull died in England, and Consuelo spent 30 years on a continent that was not the one she was born on. The symmetry is too precise to be coincidence. It is the signature of the code. The punishment for telling the truth about American aristocracy was removal from America itself. Edith Wharton spent the last 2 decades of her life at 2 French properties, the Pavillon Colombe north of Paris and Saint-Clair-le-Château in Hyères on the Riviera. France gave her what New York had withheld: intellectual respect, creative freedom, a community that valued writers as civilized beings rather than social embarrassments. The French government awarded her the Legion of Honor. French literary circles embraced her. She wrote prolifically, entertained generously, and lived with a dignity that her birthplace had denied her. But she never went home. She could not go home. The cards had stopped arriving years ago, and Wharton understood that language better than anyone alive. She died on August 11, 1937, at St. Clair. She was 75 years old. Her funeral was held in France. She was buried in the Cimetière des Gonards in Versailles. The woman who had produced the most precise and devastating portrait of American high society ever written lies in a French graveyard. Victoria Woodhull's reinvention was more dramatic. After her near destruction in the 1870s, she left America entirely. In 1877, she sailed to England with her sister Tennessee. Within 6 years, she had married John Biddulph Martin, a wealthy English banker from a respectable family. She became Mrs. Martin. She moved to the countryside. She founded a school. She supported local charities. She gave lectures on education and reform, carefully stripped of anything that might remind her audience of her former radicalism. She carefully, systematically buried every trace of the presidential candidate, free love advocate, Wall Street broker, newspaper publisher she had once been. When old copies of Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly surfaced, she tried to buy them and destroy them. When journalists referenced her American past, she denied or deflected. Her past was not discussed in her new world. Her former life was not mentioned. She lived in a manor house in Braden's Norton, Worcestershire, surrounded by English gardens and English quiet and the complete absence of anyone who knew who she had been. She had survived by becoming, in effect, a different person. She died in England on June 9, 1927, at the age of 88. She had survived nearly half a century in exile. The woman who had been the most visible, most controversial, most dangerous woman in Gilded Age America spent her last 50 years as a quiet English matron. The code did not kill Victoria Woodhull. It exiled her so completely that she erased herself. Consuelo Vanderbilt found her happiness eventually, but she found it far from New York and far from Blenheim. After her divorce from the Duke of Marlborough in 1921, she married Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and art collector. They lived in the south of France at a chateau near Dreux and later in Palm Beach. Consuelo was, by all accounts, finally content. But she had paid for that contentment with decades of misery, a forced marriage, an unwanted life in a crumbling palace, and the knowledge that her own mother had traded her for a title. The pattern holds across all three visible women: Wharton, Woodhull, Consuelo. Different classes, different weapons, different eras, the same exile. The code did not differentiate. It did not care whether you were born to the purple or fought your way in from a medicine show tent. It did not care whether your weapon was a novel or a newspaper or a memoir you waited 60 years to write. It only asked one question: did you speak? And if you had, it delivered one answer: leave. The unnamed women, man's informants, suffered a different kind of exile, not geographic, but historical. They were exiled from memory, their acts were radical, their impact was significant, and their names are lost. They broke the code, and the code erased them so completely that we cannot even mourn them by name. This is perhaps the code's greatest achievement. Not the exile of the women who spoke, but the disappearance of the women who whispered. The system's final punishment was not banishment. It was oblivion. Chapter 11. The Secrets That Outlived the Secret Keepers. Wharton's sealed papers were not opened until 1968, 31 years after her death, and what they contained shocked even the scholars who had studied her for decades. The archive at the Beinecke Library at Yale University held what Wharton had kept hidden during her lifetime. The love letters to Morton Fullerton, passionate, articulate, aching with a desire that her published work had only hinted at. And the Beatrice Palmato fragment, a piece of erotic fiction so explicit that it remained unpublished for years after its discovery. These documents revealed a woman of far greater emotional and sexual depth than the composed literary figure the public had known. Wharton had kept her own secrets even as she exposed everyone else's. The code had shaped her even as she fought it. Victoria Woodhull's reputation followed a different trajectory. For decades after her death, she was largely forgotten, a footnote in suffrage histories, an embarrassment to the movement that had once embraced her. But beginning in the 1960s and 70s, feminist scholars began to reclaim her. They saw what the Gilded Age had tried to erase, that Woodhull had been a genuine radical, a woman who challenged not just the exclusion of women from politics, but the entire architecture of sexual and economic hypocrisy that the Code of Silence sustained. Today, Victoria Woodhull is recognized as a pioneer. Her brokerage, her congressional address, her presidential campaign, her exposure of the Beecher scandal, all of it has been re-examined and revalued. The code destroyed her in her lifetime. History has reversed the verdict. Colonel Mann's legacy proved unexpectedly durable, though not in the way he might have wished. The model he created, gathering private information about public people and using it for profit, did not die when Town Topics collapsed. It was inherited. Walter Winchell, who rose to power in the 1930s, ran a gossip column that operated on essentially the same principles. Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons did the same in Hollywood. The tabloid press, the paparazzi, the entertainment media, all of them descend in a direct line from Mann's ledger. He did not invent gossip, but he invented the modern business model for it. The Emily Post irony is worth pausing on. The woman whose single decisive act, telling her husband to call the district attorney, cracked the foundation of Mann's extortion empire, went on to become the nation's foremost authority on etiquette. Etiquette, published in 1922, became one of the best-selling advice books in American history. Emily Post taught millions of Americans how to behave, how to set a table, how to write a letter, how to navigate the social world with grace. She built a career on the wreckage of the code she had helped break open. The irony is exquisite. The woman who refused to be silenced by the old rules wrote the new ones. And Blenheim Palace? The great English estate that the Marlborough marriage was designed to save stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists walk its halls. Guides explain its history. It was restored with the dowry that was extracted from an 18-year-old girl's tears. The building survived. The girl spent decades recovering. The code ensured that the building mattered more. These legacies are tangled. The truth-tellers were destroyed in their own time and vindicated in ours. The code they fought is gone in its original form, but alive in its principles. The weapons they used, the novel, the newspaper, the leaked secret, the memoir, are still the weapons of choice for anyone who wants to say what a closed community forbids. And the punishment, exile, erasure, social death is still the price. But what these four women proved, collectively and separately, is that the truth survives the punishment. The code could exile Wharton, but it could not unwrite her novels. It could jail Woodhull, but it could not unpublish her story. It could erase the informants, but it could not undo the damage they inflicted. It could silence Consuelo for 60 years, but it could not prevent her from speaking when she was ready. The code won every battle, and it lost the war. Enbauer, Chapter 12, The Code That Never Died. The rules have not changed, only the rooms have gotten bigger and the weapons faster. This is the final argument of this story, and it is the one that matters most. Because if the Code of Silence were merely a relic of the Gilded Age, a quaint artifact of an era when men wore top hats and women left calling cards, then this would be a history lesson and nothing more. It is not a history lesson, it is a diagnosis. The Code of Silence is not dead. It is the foundational logic of every closed community built on wealth and reputation. It operates on Wall Street, where traders know which firms are over-leveraged, but do not speak until the collapse forces them to. It operates in Silicon Valley, where employees know which founders are abusive, but do not speak until a journalist forces the story into print. It operates in Hollywood, where decades of predatory behavior were common knowledge inside the industry and absolute secrets outside it, until they were not. It operates in the British aristocracy, where the private lives of the royal family are managed with a rigor that Oliver Vanderbilt would have recognized and admired. The tools have changed. What Victoria Woodhull did with a weekly newspaper, her descendants do with a tweet. What Edith Wharton did with a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, a former insider can do with a podcast and a subscriber list. What man's unnamed informants did with whispered meetings and handwritten notes, an anonymous source can do with an encrypted message and a screen capture. The technology is different. The act is identical. Someone inside a closed world decides to tell the truth about how that world actually operates. And the response of the powerful remains unchanged. It is not denial. Denial requires engaging with the substance of the accusation. The powerful rarely bother. The response is exile, removal, the withdrawal of access, of warmth, of belonging. The person who speaks is not argued with. They are simply made to disappear. Prince Harry titled his memoir, Spare, borrowing the phrase that Consuelo Vanderbilt coined a century earlier. The book described the internal workings of the British royal family in terms that Consuelo would have recognized. The performance, the silence, the expectation that private suffering would be absorbed rather than spoken. The response of the institution was not a point-by-point rebuttal. It was exile, distance, the slow, surgical withdrawal of acknowledgement. The pattern is the same. It was the same in 1872, when Woodhull was jailed. It was the same in 1921, when Wharton's cards stopped arriving. It was the same in 1952, when Consuelo's memoir was met with cold shoulders. And it is the same today. The code works because it exploits something fundamental about human communities. Belonging is not a luxury. It is a need. And the threat of losing it is powerful enough to keep most people silent about what they know. The men of the Gilded Age understood this instinctively. The women who broke the code understood it too, which is why their acts required such extraordinary courage. They knew what it would cost them. They paid anyway. The question this story leaves is not whether the code will die. It will not. As long as there are closed communities built on wealth and reputation, There will be a code of silence protecting them. The question is whether the price of breaking it will ever become bearable, whether there will come a time when telling the truth about how the powerful actually live does not require exile as payment. 4 women across 6 decades could not kill this code. Their novels and newspapers and memoirs and leaked secrets wounded it, exposed it, forced it to adapt. But they did not kill it. It survived them, as it has survived every challenger, and yet. The novels are still in print. The newspapers are still cited. The memoir is still read. Blenheim Palace still stands on a foundation of tears and money, and every tourist who walks its halls can now read about the girl who paid for it. The code won in every individual case. It removed every woman who challenged it, but it could not erase what they said. The words outlived the punishment. The truth outlived the silence. The most dangerous person in any room full of powerful people is still the one willing to say what everyone already knows. That was true on Fifth Avenue in 1895. It is true in every boardroom and palace and gated community today. The code demands silence. The code enforces exile. And still, in every generation, someone speaks. The question is not whether they will pay for it. They will. The question is whether what they say will survive them. In the case of these 4 women, it did. Their words are the evidence. Their exile is the proof, and the code that punished them is their most powerful witness. It is still running, it is still punishing, and someone, somewhere, right now,